I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
I feel very strongly that we do want a world that is safe for democracy. The question is, does that world also need to be one in which other forms of government also are allowed to exist, if not because we want them to thrive, but because the alternative is one in which we are mutually escalating attacks on each other's systems, and nobody feels secure in such a world.
China has become the central fixation of U.S. foreign policy. Jessica Chen Weiss, a professor at Cornell, has devoted her career to studying China and its role in the world. But recently, Weiss spent a year on the policy planning staff at the State Department working on U.S. policy toward China. She left in July. Now, in a new essay in Foreign Affairs, she issues a forceful warning. Washington is getting China dangerously wrong. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us and for the important essay you contributed to our current issue. It's called The China Trap, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Perilous Logic of Zero-Sum Competition.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And congratulations on your centennial issue. It's really fantastic. You've done a great job.
Thank you. Well, we're very pleased to have you as part of that. So the essay is forceful and clear and eloquent warning about the course of U.S. foreign policy especially, but given the important academic work you've done over the course of your career on Chinese foreign policy and on U.S.-China relations, I want to start by giving some consideration to how we got to this point of rising tensions and this kind of ever-present risk of crisis. And I want to start not with the American side, which is, of course, the focus of your piece, but with the Chinese side. And, what has changed in Chinese foreign policy, or what has been revealed about Chinese power over the last couple of decades that have helped drive the change in U.S. policy and set off some of the dynamics that you warn about in the essay?
There's certainly an important component of truth to the fact that China has become much more repressive at home and coercive abroad. And this didn't just start with Xi Jinping. And in the essay, I look back to 2008, which was sort of a high point in sort of China's coming of age story, emerging on the world stage, hosting the Beijing Olympics then in that year. But it was also a time of unrest at home, riots in Tibet, and a campaign around the world to criticize really those ongoing human rights abuses inside Tibet at the time. And what we saw is a pretty significant turn away from the kind of halting liberalization or openness to learning from outside ideas. And so there was at the time throughout the 80s, 90s, and even into the early 2000s, more of a willingness to experiment, not national level elections, of course, but at the grassroots, a greater openness to learning and borrowing from outside models. And that, really began, I think, to change in 2008 and continuing on afterwards, where there was, accompanying China's growing power in the world stage, but also growing concern and fear about the lessons of the color revolutions and the uprisings in the Middle East. And of course, the really grave concerns about the fall of the Soviet Union and all the sources of that kind of ideological decay from within. All of that gave rise to a really renewed emphasis on kind of political loyalty, making sure that the population inside China was sort of inoculated against Western ideas, bourgeois liberalism. That was sort of the domestic trend. And then internationally, China continued to develop its military capabilities, took very hard lessons away from the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, in which the United States sent 2 aircraft carrier groups to the area. And China didn't really have very much that they could do about it at the time. And so, really began a sustained campaign to develop China's, conventional and then later nuclear arsenal to keep pace with and ultimately counter U.S. intervention in the region. And so those are the sort of long-term kind of trends inside China and in its foreign policy that kind of set the stage for a lot of the U.S. response, really toward the end of the Obama administration.
I mean, it's been really kind of head spinning how quickly this paradigm has shifted in U.S. foreign policy. And I can't think of anything other than 9/11 in my career, which seemed like such a kind of precipitous shift in U.S. foreign policy focus. One account of that change is this shift from thinking that diplomatic engagement, trade with China all of these core components of US foreign policy through the, 80s and 90s and into the aughts would help make China more liberal in politically when it came to foreign policy. Do you see the collapse of those hopes as the main cause of a change in US foreign policy, or are there kind of other things that you see as accounting for the shift that has become such a cause for concern as you write in the piece?
I think that collapse of those hopes was a part of it, but it certainly was not, I think, the main driver. Or a bunch of things came together, I think, really during especially the pandemic to get especially extreme. You can look at both sides, I think, in the acute insecurity domestically that the pandemic created, the explosion of COVID-19 in China, and the sort of ensuing response in the United States during a presidential election campaign really led to a lot of finger pointing and the kind of embrace on the Chinese side of this wolf warrior diplomacy, which of course had roots prior to that year, but it really, I think, brought into sharp sort of relief the belief in China that it was imperative that the Chinese government defend and even boast of the superiority of the Chinese political system at a time when it was under so much external criticism. And that external criticism, in turn, was in part, I think, a political stratagem of the Republicans, particularly the Trump administration, to point the finger at China rather than kind of own up to the botched initial response to the pandemic in the United States. Now, fast forward, we have a much better situation here now with the success of vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, compared with the COVID situation in China, which is just, still stuck in this kind of old zero COVID mentality and lockdown. So, that argument that China did better is, I think, really only kind of relevant to that early first year or so of the pandemic. That I don't think there's any basis for that claim. Certainly not that autocracy somehow did better than democracies in this. That is kind of bogus. But at that moment in time, I think it set in motion a kind of downward spiral, an unleashing, if you will, of all of those who had wanted to push for kind of a more confrontational relationship on both sides.
You see a kind of momentum that has taken over in US foreign policy, really across parties and across administrations, that you see as counterproductive and even dangerous. So, take us forward a bit from some of these changes on the Chinese side and in the relationship more broadly to what you see as this worrying trend and course for US foreign policy. What did you see when you were in government and as an observer of the relationship more broadly?
So I think what the overall sort of climate of competition has created is a challenge for those who want to put forward kind of a positive vision for where we should go. That efforts to do so are seen as sort of insufficiently kind of tough on the challenges, the real challenges that China and others pose around the world. And it also creates, I think, in the broader political context, a need to react to everything that China is doing. I mean, the same is true on the Chinese side. And so I think what you have is kind of an imbalance here, a weighting of efforts to compete, confront, and punish the other side, rather than thinking of strategically the ways in which, if we want to avoid this kind of growing confrontation spiraling toward catastrophe, we're going to have to identify ways to do things in kind of coordinated, if unilateral, fashion to take kind of baby steps back from the brink. Because otherwise, this sort of action reaction spiral is going to only head in one direction. And that's going to be disastrous for not only the possibility of military conflict, but also kind of the erosion of the already weakened international order, the institutions that have, survived really in various forms since the end of World War II. And so, that's what the international, I think, stage will end up looking like. At home, I really worry about kind of the perverse consequences for the quality of deliberation, tolerance, and dynamism in our own society. Our liberal democracy is really, I think, premised on the idea that you may not agree with me, but you and I both defend our right to disagree. And we welcome that, and that's the source of our ability to innovate and also attract people from around the world to our shores. And I think the administration was right to say, as Secretary Blinken did in May, that the United States is lucky when students and scholars come from around the world to the United States to learn and to study and to stay and work. And that's been long a source of a comparative advantage, but one that I think we risk losing as different voices are either drowned out or made to feel unwelcome, as there is absolutely a challenge, a threat that we must deal with in terms of espionage and illicit efforts to steal technology, similarly to guard against efforts to quell academic freedom and freedoms of speech. But the effort to do so in a blanket way, if it ends up, hurting this very dynamic and open society, then it will have been counterproductive to those things that we are striving to protect.
So there's a lot we'll want to come back to there, but I want to linger on this point you made, which I think is really underlies in some ways the entire analysis and critique of the piece. And I'll quote you here. You write, US politicians and policymakers are becoming so focused on countering China that they risk losing sight of the affirmative interests and values that should underpin US strategy. We've been so focused on competing that we forget what we're competing for. As you step back and look at US interests, more broadly, how would you define those affirmative values and interests? How should we think of those goals, and how should that guide the way we approach the question of competition?
So I would put forward three, but this piece was really an invitation for us collectively to think about what really matters to America. What are the minimum interests that we need to defend and protect in the world? I would say the first is avoiding war, avoiding major conflict with a nuclear armed near peer competitor. I would say second is making space, both in our budget and in our political conversation, for tackling common challenges, ones that rise to the level of existential, including climate change and pandemics that we're still battling. The third would be our political way of life and our social way of life. So I feel very strongly that we do want a world that is safe for democracy. The question is, does that world also need to be one in which other forms of government also are allowed to exist, if not because we want them to thrive, but because the alternative is one in which we are mutually escalating attacks on each other's systems, and nobody feels secure in such a world.
Are there specific things where you think American rhetoric needs to be more restrained, where we need to kind of accept our lack of capacity to really change Chinese policy, whether it's in, Xinjiang or Hong Kong or elsewhere? What do we need to accept that we can't change? I think this becomes the kind of hard part of the debate.
It is a really hard part. And I think that there's a lot of room for thinking about what kinds of rhetoric as well as what kinds of policies would make a difference to those that we are trying to help. And so, whether it's China's crackdown in Hong Kong or the brutal repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, are there things that we can do to make it easier for, for example, the United Kingdom has done, to allow people to come to our shores to resettle, and to think about just how effective are the sanctions on Chinese officials, and to what extent are they in tension with other objectives, including the Biden administration's statement that we don't seek to transform China. And so figuring out the balance between standing up for human rights and also not trying to change another country's political system. I think there's a wide spectrum there, and it doesn't mean saying we can't do anything. It just means thinking about realistically what are the sets of policies that can move the ball and which are likely to be potentially even counterproductive. And there's a lot of political science research about the backlash effect, where foreign criticism of human rights practices in another country, particularly when it's from a country that's already seen as geopolitically antagonistic like the United States is to China, that criticism actually has the opposite effect inside of China in terms of eroding support for concerns about women's rights, minority rights, etc. And so when we think about when the Chinese Communist Party criticizes Black Lives Matter, domestic politics, and problems inside the United States, is the reaction here among liberals like, yeah, that's a big problem? It's like, we already knew that. We didn't need you to tell us. And in fact, it actually sometimes makes it harder to make progress on those issues, because then others inside that system can say, oh, you're just parroting the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda. And he's like, no, that's not the case. But the fact that those criticisms are picked up then by the other side, by a geopolitical competitor, make it that much harder to tackle those domestic problems. And I think that logic kind of works in reverse on the Chinese side as well.
I want to linger on this very powerful point you made a bit ago and that you make in the essay about the effect of the focus on competition on US democracy and US society more broadly. The first piece of this is the changes in the kind of openness and quality of debate about China policy. You write in the piece, quote, when individuals feel the need to out-hawk one another to protect themselves and advance professionally, the result is groupthink. How have you seen the China policy debate change in the course of your work on this, including your time in government? And what about the nature of that debate right now worries you?
So I was really struck, just in the last several months, talking to two different folks working in the broader China policy community, not in government, but outside, who told me that they felt the need to position themselves as hawkish as the next person in the room. And otherwise, they feared that they wouldn't be invited to meetings or be as successful in advancing their careers. Another person said they didn't feel that they could criticize some of the products that were coming out of other organizations because, again, when you exist on soft money and you're trying to advance within an overall climate in which there is what seems like a politically correct thing to say or do, then you, I think, reduce the set of views that are allowed to be said or feel politically safe to voice. And that really, unfortunately, I think reduces the quality of analytical rigor and as well as the quality of policy debate. If we're only considering a particular set of viewpoints and you're discouraging potentially contrary voices, then there's a lot of research on democratic deliberation that suggests you're going to get to worse outcomes as a result. Not that you necessarily need to agree with those contrary viewpoints. And of course, I would say, the state of debate in the United States is far superior in terms of that deliberation than you get in China. It's much, much worse there. And I think that there are real concerns about the pernicious effects of that kind of echo chamber in Beijing as well. But we're a democracy where we should be. We aspire to be. And so that, I think, is very troubling and one that we should all strive to protect and nurture a more deliberative conversation. I think you've really done actually an excellent job, in foreign affairs lately of trying to nurture that. And then I look forward to seeing more.
Thank you for that. We certainly try, and your piece is one important element of that. Another part of your concern relates to innovation and research and the openness of the American academic community, especially when it comes to fears of Chinese espionage and IP theft and technology theft. What are the consequences of the kind of crackdown on the ability of especially kind of Chinese researchers to take part in American scientific research? What worries you there?
Well, let me say, first of all, that there are definitely, types of research that should not involve foreign nationals, right? There's a whole process of classification and such that erect these kinds of warranted protective measures. But what I'm worried about is the efforts to discourage scientific research and collaboration, that kind of open model of science that has been, really crucial to driving the United States as a hub for innovation and scientific research for decades. And the proof is in the pudding. I think here those surveys that I cited in the essay, which suggest that almost half, 40 some percent of early career scientists in physics across all nationalities that have come here to the United States to work, don't think the United States is a welcoming environment any longer for science. And it's much, much worse amongst scientists of Asian descent or of Chinese origin, many of them permanent residents or naturalized citizens. Upwards of 60% don't feel safe any longer and are thinking about moving elsewhere. So even if you think of this as a long-term, competition for, technological dominance, if you will, which even though I don't necessarily subscribe to that paradigm, but even if you do, this is an own goal if we don't get it right, because you are the talent piece of that kind of the future of innovation really rests upon our ability to attract and maintain and nurture kind of an open, secure, and supportive environment for science.
We'll be back after a short break.
Young people of color confront many challenges that deter them from considering, pursuing, and succeeding at careers in international affairs. The authors of the Young Black Leader's Guide to a Successful Career in International Affairs, What the Giants Want You to Know, address these challenges, drawing on the experiences of Black American leaders in the field to provide practical advice. Order the book from Lynn Reiner Publishers at reiner.com or Amazon today. That's RIENNER.com.
Another cost to the focus on competition that you explore in the piece is the diminished ability of the two countries to cooperate or collaborate when it comes to shared challenges, climate change probably being the biggest and most important of these. What is the kind of right approach to working together on those kinds of issues, even amid rising tensions and competition in lots of other areas? What has gone off course when it comes to that kind of collaboration?
What I worry is that we will see this sort of escalating spiral of hostility crowding out the space and the resources to address this really fundamentally existential problem of making sure that the world remains habitable for us. And that's in our national interest. But the more that this becomes a military forward competition, the less there will be not only for addressing, climate change, but also, figuring out, how to address hunger and other infectious disease, all the other kind of challenges that don't really have borders.
A lot of these concerns are about kind of corrosive, longer term effects on US policy and US democracy. But you also warn of the risks of a crisis, of escalating tensions, really rising level of conflict. The area that you focus on is the greatest risk of crisis. And I think lots of others would agree with you, especially in the wake of Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's visit a few weeks ago, is, of course, Taiwan. So, what worries you about Taiwan? How do you see those dynamics leading to a crisis that could escalate out of control very quickly?
I worry a lot about potential crisis over Taiwan. We seem to have narrowly avoided a kinetic crisis following Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August, largely due to the fact that the Biden administration didn't choose a kind of, or nor did Taiwan choose an immediate kind of military response.
So, China responded militarily, but there was restraint on the US and Taiwanese side, is the upshot.
That's right. That's right. Right. So to deny them maybe the crisis that maybe some saw in Beijing. But I think the question then remains is how do you bolster the eroded status quo in the Taiwan Strait where, Chinese military aircraft are making daily incursions across that center line as a response to Speaker Pelosi's visit. And that's, I think there's a real concern here that the response when it comes from Taiwan and from the United States, whether that's Taiwan shooting down drones or something else that takes place, that it continues to accelerate this sort of action-reaction spiral where each side taking unilateral actions to respond to what they see as the growing threat of the other side's actions.
A lot of the growing tension in the Taiwan Strait seems to have been driven by Beijing, and some of that is actions in Hong Kong over the last couple of years. Some of that is growing military activity. What can the United States do to stabilize the situation? Are there steps that the U.S. can take unilaterally that you think would help at least somewhat reduce the risk of that kind of crisis?
So I talk about in the piece the challenge of unilateral actions, particularly ones that seem to be trying to lower the temperature. Because I think on both sides, and in Washington in particular, I think there's a perception, which I think is, to some extent accurate, that unilateral steps toward restraint will be seen as signs either of weakness or of concession. And so I don't suggest sort of unilateral changes that the United States can do. First of all, I think that some of the primary drivers of Beijing's urgency or sense of pessimism are trends on Taiwan, both in terms of demographic trends, kind of generational evolution away from a sense of identification with the mainland, as well as political developments in Beijing and the crackdown in Hong Kong, making any kind of one country, two systems approach pretty much anathema to politically on Taiwan. So there's not, I think a magic wand that the United States could wave. But that said, I think that there are ingredients of the framework that has worked for decades that I think still remain very important. The first of those is one China, first of all and foremost, and there are some political candidates in the United States that have suggested that it's time to recognize Taiwan diplomatically. That to me is like the waving the flag in front of the bull. I mean, that would be a very clear step across China's red lines. And even if, Beijing is not looking for a fight, I don't doubt for a moment that they would authorize the use of force immediately to combat that. I could say that the second, I think, component is maintaining strategic ambiguity, or what is sometimes known as dual deterrence, which is, of course, enhancing deterrence against the use of force by Beijing, but it also means deterring unilateral steps by authorities in Taiwan to change the political status quo in ways that move the island further toward independence, de jure independence, or permanent separation. And that's particularly important, I think, in the run-up to the 2024 elections, insofar as political rhetoric on Taiwan has historically, in the 2000s, been a great concern. And Washington acted then, I think, responsibly to kind of rein that back in to ensure the kind of stability that has benefited and allowed Taiwan to develop its democratic way of life, despite, the threat of coercion and ultimately military force by Beijing.
One of the other byproducts of growing US-China competition that you lay out comes in the context of the war in Ukraine and the Russia-China relationship. You see US actions as really reinforcing the convergence between Moscow and Beijing. Is there anything the US can do, given the current environment, to reduce that convergence, to somewhat complicate that coordination between the two capitals, or do you see that as a inevitable progression from here?
No, I think that the administration has had some success at deterring immediate material assistance, both military and widespread sanctions evasion, by warning of the consequences. And I think that there are elements of the Chinese system that continue to see that continued access to international capital markets and technology as, essential for China's continued modernization and, to use Xi Jinping's word, the national rejuvenation. And so there are, I think, limits, first of all, to the sort of so-called no limits partnership between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. But that said, I think that so long as Chinese analysts and leaders see no strategic benefits to working with the international community to rein in Russia's, aggressive actions, only risks or liabilities to putting distance between Beijing and Moscow, we're not fundamentally going to alter that kind of long-term trajectory. Because I do think that there is a real debate inside China as to how close to stand to Russia. But so long as resisting the United States remains kind of the key strategic priority for policymakers inside China, they're going to continue to stay close to Russia.
Simply because they see Putin as useful in distracting the US and complicating our task and reinforcing world order.
And because if, the United States and China should come to blows, Beijing is going to want Moscow and Russia to be an important source of support in resisting whatever comes.
This, I think, points to what becomes another really challenging question in this debate, especially for, I think, those who, like you, are warning of the current course of China policy in the US. And that comes to this question of what role China should have in shaping the international system. You note in the essay that we're at a moment when we're past US unipolarity, the kind of ability of the US to shape the international system, not quite single-handedly, but almost single-handedly, is certainly less true than it was a few decades ago. And that necessarily means that a power like China is going to have some role in determining the course of the international system, the way institutions work, the way international norms work. That's relatively easy to say at a high level, but I think very hard, again, to articulate what kinds of concessions or what that would really mean when it comes to these big questions about the course of global order over the coming years and decades. So when you say at a somewhat conceptual level that we need to accept that China is going to have a role in shaping the system, what does that mean? I mean, how do we make that space, again, without sacrificing interests or values that are really kind of core to the American conception of its own security and our sense of, how the world should work?
First of all, the premise of bringing China into the international system was that the world would be safer with China on the inside rather than the outside. And even as we remain, very concerned about what China is doing on the inside, I think it still remains the case that it's better than what China might be doing on the outside without our ability to shape and negotiate, really, again, the terms of coexistence inside the international system. And I reread again recently, I think you published a very excellent piece by Stacey Goddard, which makes that case, which is that it's not that China is not going to reshape the rules. That is unfortunately a given. The question is whether or not the world is better with them reshaping or having some input into the rules of the system from the inside rather than writing them on the outside where we are not even a participant. And so I think that the reality is that this is going to happen regardless. And the question is not where should we just make unilateral concessions, but rather how can we negotiate, where it is that we would welcome and on what terms would we welcome China's contributions and participation in the multilateral system. For example, the WTO has made progress recently on, COVID vaccines and fishery subsidies. The G20 common framework for debt relief is also, that's another instance in where there was pressure put on China to work within this framework. And that, maybe belatedly, but still is an example of how we can continue to encourage China to work within the system, even as they continue, of course, to hedge their bets by developing alternative structures. So I think really the question is not a matter of expecting that either the United States or China will forego these kind of fit for purpose smaller groupings that privilege their interests, but that can we also at the same time invest equal, if not more effort in kind of reinvigorating these encompassing institutions like the United Nations, like the WTO, like the G20,
When you look at the Chinese debate about its role in the world and the relationship with the US, how much space is there for, any reasonable discussion of accommodation or cooperation? I guess it's another way of saying if there were changes that you would see as productive on the US side, what would the response from Beijing be like?
So I think there's reason to believe that there is at least the possibility that leaders, including all the way at the top, would be interested in a more stable relationship. That said, I think that the climate of debate inside China is much, much more nationalistic and hawkish than even that here in the United States, in the sense of not creating space for voices of dissent. I mean, it's an authoritarian regime. And so there isn't a kind of vibrant debate about how should China go about conducting its foreign policy. But there are, despite that, glimmers of dissent, including the question of how closely China should stand with Russia, following the invasion of Ukraine. And I think that there remain elements inside China that continue to value that kind of openness to international markets, capital. This isn't about political reform, although even there too, those voices may still exist. But I'm not talking about liberals in that sense. But there are still these sort of the economic or technocratic aspects of China that don't want to see the kind of security spiral take over everything because they know that it will be detrimental to China's continued economic and technological flourishing. And so there are aspects, I think, of frustration, even inside the Chinese foreign ministry, with the kind of wolf warrior tone that's been set from the top. I don't think that China knows what it wants in 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, of course, they may have some visions, just like we are going to win the 21st century. But what does that even mean? We don't know. They don't know. China has had a long history of crossing the river by feeling for stones. And so figuring out how to shape the environment, this is one thing the administration is very clear about, shape the environment. Well, okay, what does that look like? It means, making very clear that China faces a choice, that escalation, aggression will be met with correspondingly severe costs. But that if China were to moderate its behavior, that we wouldn't use that opportunity to push the envelope further and continue to strangle their aspirations for continued prosperity and growth. I mean, that's what I think the best we can hope for. Again, it's certainly not going to work overnight, but I think that really the only alternative is the kind of continuing spiral toward catastrophe that we're on.
It's a really sharp point in the piece, this notion that deterrence doesn't just require making the cost of an action clear. It also involves making clear the benefits of not taking that action. And that the problem with the US policy debate now is we can't talk about those benefits, which I think is a really powerful point in the piece. Lingering a bit on Xi Jinping, who kind of really looms over this discussion from the US perspective, you make the point in the piece that this is not all about Xi Jinping, that the changes in China really, preceded him and go beyond him. But we will all be watching the Party Congress in China next month in October and wondering what that will mean for Chinese policy and for Xi Jinping in the wake of his receiving this third term, presumably. What do you expect to change? Do you see a more hawkish China, a more assertive China, a more restrained China? Do you think anything will be different once we get past the Party Congress?
So I'm pretty agnostic on what this will mean. I certainly expect him to get a third term, and I expect that he will probably emerge somewhat more secure in power if the projections are accurate. But what that means in terms of China's domestic and international behavior, I think there's a big question mark. It could go in different directions. Because I think it means that with the Party Congress behind him, Xi Jinping can afford to take more risks. But those risks don't necessarily need to be, using force against Taiwan. That could also be moving away from zero COVID, taking a little bit of a longer view, not requiring that demonstrations of competence or performance or strength in the immediate term. And so that could, I think, also create space for, a somewhat different trajectory. So that, I think, holds out hope that, we aren't, destined to face a more aggressive China after the Party Congress. But it will, in large part, depend on, the choices that we put on the table.
Let's try to end on a relatively optimistic note. You warn in the piece in the introduction, and I'll quote you again here, that, quote, Washington has struggled to define success or even a steady state short of total victory or total defeat that both governments could eventually accept and at a cost that citizens, businesses, and other stakeholders would be willing to bear. How would you go about defining success? If we can kind of get this right, what is a relatively optimistic trajectory for the US-China relationship and US power in the world as it relates to that competition?
Well, I suggested in the essay that if Washington and Moscow could arrive at détente during the Cold War, there's no reason that Beijing and Washington can't do so today. That would, I would say, be the minimum, which is like baby steps to lower the temperature, to begin to engage in more regular and expansive conversations, discussions about what the future of the international system might look like, what are our red lines, what are their red lines, what are the kinds of ways in which we might be prepared to, provided that there is some kind of reciprocity, be willing to bound the competition, set rules of fair play, and begin to create an environment in which we are doing a little bit less to act unilaterally and more to be acting within sort of accepted bounds of behavior on both sides. And that, I hope, that kind of movement towards stability, even if it doesn't amount to some grand framework or certainly not a grand bargain. I don't even expect this to necessarily need to last. I would first of all settle for getting through the next 2 years, and then the next 8 after that, we would have survived what some are calling the most dangerous decade. If we could arrive at 2030 without having experienced some of these kind of eyeball-to-eyeball crises, I would say that that is already the beginnings of success. If we can build upon that to kind of a more revitalized, reformed international system, that we can start to see progress on those fronts as well. And hopefully in the interim, we will have created the space again, as I said, to make sure that we're doing what we need domestically and internationally to tackle the extremely pressing problem of climate change and whatever the next pandemic might look like.
It is a sign of where we are that is what passes for optimism these days, but we'll take it. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us and for the really powerful essay in our current issue, which is called The China Trap. Thank you again.
Thanks, Dan. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. You can find the articles that we discussed on today's show at foreignaffairs.com. The Foreign Affairs interview is produced by Kate Brannon, Julia Fleming-Dresser, and Marcus Zachariah. Special thanks also to Grace Finlayson, Caitlin Joseph, Nora Revenaugh, Asher Ross, and Gabrielle Sierra. Our theme music was written and performed by Robin Hilton. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you heard, please take a minute to rate and review it. We release a new show every other Thursday. Thanks for listening.